Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned with a very special episode today because even though it's not Epic Comic Book Wednesday today, we are talking about a comic book. We're talking about the greatest science fiction comic book ever created. Never was there a better science fiction comic book before this one. Never was there a greater comic book science that was science fiction after this one. It is the greatest science fiction comic book of all time. Of course, I'm talking about Weird Science. Weird Science, which was published alongside Weird Fantasy, which was pretty much the same comic book. Weird Science and Weird Fantasy were really the same comic book. And they were combined eventually into Weird Science Fantasy, which became incredible science fiction. But through all of those title changes, it was always Weird Science. It was always the same comic. And it was fantastic. Published by the greatest comic book company that ever existed, EC Comics. Weird Science was one of the first and definitely the greatest science fiction comic books. It was amazing. It was a child of the pulps from the 1930s and 1940s, all those great old science fiction pulps that were published back in those olden days. Had a great influence on this comic book, as indeed did the science fiction that was being published at the time in the 1950s, and astounding science fiction in some other places. So this is a remarkable comic book. Perfect for Rocket Summer, which is going on next month, which is why one of the reasons I'm talking about it. Because if ever there was a comic book that was perfect for Rocket Summer, a celebration on BookTube that happens in July, which is all about classic science fiction, man, this is definitely the best choice you could have for a comic book. It's something. So let's talk about this comic book, Weird Science. Published by EC. EC, of course, was best known then and is best known now for its horror comic books. Tales from the Crypt is the title you usually think of when you think of EC Comics. It had some great horror comic books. It had some great crime comic books. EC Comics did some fantastic stuff. But for me, my personal favorite of all of EC Comics, it was their science fiction comics. Weird Science was the best, in my opinion. It had some of the greatest artwork you'll ever see in comic books from Wally Wood, Al Williamson, and some others. This was just fantastic stuff. Great science fiction. Very pulpy. It's very pulpy science fiction. Definitely in the EC tradition. There's more than a little horror in these stories. Shocking stories with twist endings, something that you usually would see in an EC comic book. It's just great stuff. And they are now being reprinted. They've been reprinted for a while by Dark Horse Comic Books in these Dark Horse books, and these fantastic archive editions. I think these are great. They're just beautiful editions of these EC comics. They're not that expensive, these softcover editions. And the comics look fantastic. Some people don't like them so much because they were recolored. That doesn't bother me at all, the recoloring. Probably because I can't see color, Roger, worth a damn. But some people it bothers. But I think they just look fantastic. Just crisp and clear and wonderful. I originally read these comics in some reprints that were published during the 1990s. My stepfather collected these comics, but mostly he had horror comics. There was some science fiction in there. But a lot of these issues I read when they were reprinted in the 90s. Not always were they the best as far as printing quality were concerned. Some of those comics were pretty smudgy. Not something you have to worry about here. So this first volume has the first 6 issues of Weird Science. You can see the covers for all of them right there. Now, it did inexplicably and confusingly start off with issue number 12. It says issue number 12 on the first issue, but that's because they continued on from another comic book that was canceled. Back in the olden days, when numbering on comic books didn't matter so much, if you had a comic book and you wanted to switch it, wanted to cancel it and start another comic, you just change the titles but keep the numbering. And that's what they did here. But then they went back and renumbered it, so it's all very confused when you try to figure out the numbering system when it came to Weird Science. But that's okay. They got it figured out in these volumes. This first issue has a great cover by Al Feldstein. Feldstein, who was affectionately known as Stiff Figures Feldstein, because his figures tended to be stiff. And Feldstein wasn't if you put his artwork and you put it next to Wally Wood or Al Williamson or somebody like that, his work can look pretty crude, but I love him, and I think there's something just stylistically beautiful about his work, particularly some of the covers he did for these early issues of Weird Science. So this archive edition, beautiful book, has an introduction appropriately enough by George Lucas, who was a big fan of Weird Science. And this first issue, the very first issue, has a story by Harvey Kurtzman. And he was just a brilliant artist. And he did great work in EC Comics, and he does a great job on this first issue. Fantastic stuff. And in this issue, we also have a Feldstein story. As you can see, stiff figures, but stylistically, I really like his work, particularly some of his science fiction work. And he did just some awesome covers. I particularly like this one. This is a Feldstein cover. What are you barking about? Excuse Rhonda. She's barking at aliens, obviously. This is just a fantastic cover. You got a lot of really great covers in Weird Science and Weird Fantasy, as you'll see in a minute. And Feldstein did a lot of the earlier covers. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong. I always pronounce names wrong. But some of these covers were just great. I mean, just look at that. That's brilliant. These early issues. Panic! More Feldstein work. These early issues were just wonderful. Had just great stories. Usually talking about the future doom of humankind. And a lot of the artists who worked on the other EC books did work in here. Here you have ghastly Graham Ingalls do a story for Weird Science. And look at that. That's the perfect rocket, by the way, for Rocket Summer. That's just brilliantly done. More Feldstein. More Feldstein. Look at that. That's just awesome. And here you have some Wally Wood. Wally Wood starts getting really good on this comic book. This is just great stuff. And he starts to do, this is the second volume, he starts to do a lot of the covers. He takes over a lot of the cover work from Feldstein. And his stuff is dynamite. See if I can get some of his covers up there. Yeah, here we go. I mean, look at that. I mean, that is the ultimate in pulp science fiction. Clearly you see the influence of those old pulps here on the Weird Science cover. And Wally Wood was just such a brilliant artist, and he just kept getting better and better on Weird Science. I mean, just look at that work. It's just remarkable. And if you're interested in the history of comic books, this is an artist you have to pay attention to, Wally Wood. Recently, when I mention him, I'm usually talking about Marvel Comics, at some of the stuff he did later in his career, but it's the stuff that he did in weird science. It's this stuff that he will always be remembered for. This is where he pretty much made his name, I think, was in the EC Comics. I mean, he did a lot of other wonderful stuff, but it's in these comic books. I mean, that's where he really became great. Just a legendary figure in comics. And you can see why when you look at some of these covers and read some of these stories. I mean, just look at that. And Wally Wood is in pretty much, he eventually is in pretty much every issue of these. We also have Joe Orlando do a lot of work. Our excellent artist, Joe Orlando. And he's in a lot of these old science fiction comic books. Just a lot of really, really great stuff. Another wonderful Wally Wood cover. Look at that. Fantastic. And this, I think, is Al Williamson. So Al Williamson is another artist who did some of his greatest work in these science fiction comic books, these science, weird science and science fantasy. And he drew comics for a long, long time. I knew Al Williamson, actually, the first time I really read his stuff was when he did the film adaptation of Empire Strikes Back, which was just glorious. And I never read any of his science fiction stuff, or at least not a lot of it, until much later than that. Yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful stuff. And so, also, of course, like I said, there's Weird Fantasy. Weird Fantasy was the other science fiction comic book, which is, like I said, it's just weird science. It's the same comic book. There's really not too much that was different in Weird Fantasy. It's great stuff. More Al Feldstein. Just an amazing comic book. So, like I said, all of these are readily available. More Wally Wood. This is a great cover by Feldstein. Look at that. That's great. Just pulp awesomeness, some of these stories. Amazing. Amazing stuff. Now, eventually, like I said, they were combined into one comic book. For some reason, the science fiction comics were never as popular as the horror comics or the crime comics. Even though, as far as quality is concerned, I still think it's some of the best stuff they ever did. But science fiction just wasn't as popular as horror or crime. But they wanted to keep producing the comic. And so eventually they did combine it into one comic book that had a magnificent cover right here with weird science fantasy. Look at that Wally Wood cover. That's just amazing. And so you had a few issues of weird science fantasy. And you had Iando Binder's I, Robot, his Adam Link stories. So I, Robot, you think Isaac Asimov. But Iando Binder did a series of stories, the Adam Link stories, with that original title, and which Isaac Asimov just took basically for himself when he published his first book of robot stories. But this is the original I, Robot by Iando Binder, and it's illustrated by Joe Orlando. And it's just awesome. Just a great set of stories. And it became incredible science fiction. They just retitled it. I'm not exactly sure why they retitled it, but this is after the Comics Code Authority arrived. You see the big stupid stamp. So all the horror comic books by this point were gone, and they had to revamp all their whole line of comic books. The science fiction line survived under the title Incredible Science Fiction with the stupid stamp. That's a whole sad story, which I don't know that I've ever talked about the whole origin of the Comics Code Authority and all the nonsense that led up to it. But, Joe Orlando was still doing work in this book, and it was some pretty fantastic stuff. And I think number 33 was the last issue of Incredible Science Fiction. Beautiful, beautiful cover by Wally Wood. I could be wrong there. But I think there was only this one Incredible Science Fiction Archive edition. So I think this is the end of the line for the science fiction comics. It was great stuff. I recommend all of these. Like I said, perfect for Rocket Summer. I love, love, love these comic books. And next month in July, I'm definitely going to be picking these up again and reading some weird science and weird fantasy and all that stuff. It's amazing. Okay, I'll shut up. I will catch you next time.